This is a screenshot video, and it addresses the topic of consideration. And we have two parts to the notes, so this video will pertain only to part one. It's just several pages. I'm going to post an announcement, by the way, about the book. Uh, and I appreciate that, at least as of Sunday, February 5, as I record this, that the book has not been made available to you. Please don't try to find it elsewhere. I can't guarantee that you will. I know it's frustrated, understandably frustrated some of you. And I have asked that the department make inquiry of the bookstore if they can give us an update. And what I can tell you is no one is falling behind. We'll pick up with using the book when it becomes available. And if it's too far into the semester, we're simply not going to be using the book. And I will supplement, as I have been, uh, with the videos and other material uh, with the book not being available. So obviously these notes were made when we did have the book available, but my reference to chapter 3 in the book doesn't detract at all from the value of the notes or the value of this screenshot video. So we're addressing the topic of consideration. You'll remember when we identified at the beginning of the course the four uh, elements of a valid contract. One of them was consideration. And at that point, we simply said that consideration was a bargain for exchange of legal value. We have a far more comprehensive definition of consideration, and we really just want to start to feel comfortable with that definition. And to set up the definition, we've got to keep in mind that all contracts involve promises. If it's a mutual exchange of promises, we have a bilateral contract. If it's a promise in exchange for an act, we have a unilateral contract. And the definition that we're working at seeks to answer this question: is there legally sufficient consideration? That's the terminology that's used. Again, is there legally sufficient consideration to support the promise? By the way, the good news is there typically is, because it's the motivation of parties to enter into a contract, which is going to reflect actually the existence of the legally sufficient consideration. If we take a look at this definition, we say that legally sufficient consideration exists to support a promise if, in exchange for the promise, and we'll see that's an important part of the definition a little bit later, the party receiving the promise agrees to perform an act or performs an act, if it's a unilateral contract, that the party is otherwise under no legal duty to perform, or the party receiving the promise agrees in exchange for the promise to refrain from performing an act the party otherwise has a legal right to perform, or if it's unilateral, in fact, the party refrains from performing an act that the party otherwise has a legal right to perform. Let's take this apart a little bit. And an example I use just to show the existence of the first part of the definition, you and I enter into a contract and you're going to promise to pay me $10,000 for painting the exterior of your house. Well, there's legally sufficient consideration to support your promise to pay me, because in exchange for your promise, I am promising to perform an act, paint your house, that otherwise I had no legal duty to perform. In the same vein, there's legally sufficient consideration to support my promise to paint your house, because in exchange for my promise, you are agreeing to pay me $10,000, which otherwise you had no legal duty to pay. So this is a straightforward uh, application of the definition. We can get to another part of the definition where we talked about in exchange for a promise, a party is refraining or promising to refrain from an act they otherwise had a legal duty to perform. And I again mentioned the book, but I can tell you about the case. It's a classic case back in the 19th century that actually, they tell me, took place, or the facts arose in the town of Elma, one of our second ring suburbs to the city of Buffalo. In any event, an uncle promises to pay his nephew a certain sum of money if the nephew did not smoke, drink, or gamble until he reached a certain age, and the age was 21. So we can understand the uncle's promise set up a unilateral contract, or better said, an offer to enter into a unilateral contract where it would be enforceable if the nephew did not smoke. So, and I'm sorry, I was just interrupted. But again, getting back to Hammer versus Sidway, the uncle promises to pay the nephew if he doesn't smoke, drink, or gamble. And the age is 21, by the way. In other words, he said, if you don't do this until you're 21, I will pay you X number of dollars. And so what happens is the nephew reports after he reaches the age of 21, I haven't smoked or drank or gambled. And the uncle said, I know. So there's no question of fact, because the uncle accepts his representation that he didn't smoke, drink, or gamble until the age of 21, that the nephew had, if you will, fulfilled his end of the deal. Now, I'll spare you the procedural stuff because it's an uncle and a nephew, but the nephew assigns his right to the contract. The uncle has died, and we have the assignee of a contract and the executor of an estate, but we don't have to worry about that. The question becomes, is the uncle's promise enforceable? In other words, was there legally sufficient consideration to support the promise? And because what happens is the uncle's estate says, we're not going to pay you. And if we go back to our definition of consideration, we're at the or part, or the party receiving the promise agrees to refrain from performing an act they otherwise had a legal right to perform. And as I point out, in New York, back then at least, a minor or person under the age of 21 had the right to smoke, drink, and gamble before the age of 21. So the nephew was refraining from performing an act that he otherwise had a legal right to perform. And that, the court ruled in this famous case of Hammer versus Sidway, amounted to legally sufficient consideration. I guess you could contrast this. I could probably come up with an example, but if I said to someone, I will pay you $5,000 if in the next year you don't use cocaine, and the person claims that they didn't use cocaine for a year, there would be no legally sufficient consideration, because in the first instance, unlike the nephew, they didn't. The person in this example didn't have the legal right to use cocaine. I also point out that for there to be legally sufficient consideration, it must be given in exchange for a promise. And I will pick up that point in the next posting when we talk about the doctrine of past consideration. So this will conclude this screenshot video.